Okay, this is the fifth panel, Potential Compliance Challenges. I'm Jay Baris, a partner at Shearman and Sterling in New York. And before I introduce the other panelists, I would just like to give you my standard disclaimers that I'm here in my capacity as a moderator, pundit, and troublemaker, not as a lawyer. And the views I express here today are my own. They are not necessarily those of my fellow panelists, Macomb School, University of Texas, the Securities and Exchange Commission, any political party. And in fact, the views I express here today are not necessarily my own, depending on who I'm representing. Actually, one more here. Nothing I shall say, shall constitute a recommendation of any kind. As a lawyer here, even though nothing I'm saying here is legal advice, does not create an attorney-client relationship. Therefore, I have no fiduciary duty to you, nor do I have any obligation to act in your best interest.
We didn't really rehearse this, but I think if you boiled it down to the plain English CRS form, you get what you pay for.
That's right. Okay, on that note, to my left is David Peavler, who is the regional director of the SEC's office right here in Fort Worth, one of the major offices covering Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kansas. And really, David needs no introduction. Also served 15 years as senior lawyer in the SEC's enforcement division and actually worked on the dark side at one point. Next to me, to my immediate right, is James Anderson, who is a partner in the asset management group at Willkie, Farr, and Gallagher, whose practice covers the entire range of securities regulation, and he just knows his stuff. And on the end there is Tom Selman. I knew Tom when we both had black hair. Tom recently retired from FINRA, where he served in a number of senior capacities and was executive vice president of the regulatory policy and as chief legal compliance officer for a number of years. Also, surrounded by these three people, I feel very small. So anyway, what we're going to talk about today, you've heard a lot about regulation best interest, and you've heard about the policy behind it, you've heard about what it is. Today we're going to really focus on some of the in-the-weeds compliance challenges that people face. What do you do when your client, when I mean your client, if you're a lawyer, compliance officer, outside lawyer, what do you do when you're confronted with how to comply with this new rule? What's it going to be like? What do you think about? What are people worrying about at night? And we start at the beginning. Client intake. You got to figure out some place to start, and client intake sounds like a reasonable place. So I'm going to ask Tom, what are the challenges that firms face thinking about client intake?
Yeah, I think the challenges are similar, frankly, to what they face today, except the timing is different. So the firm will have to get a client profile, information about the client, and in this case now, we'll have to get it before an account recommendation is made. And the profile has to include, among other things, information about the client's age, other investments, financial situation and needs, the tax status of the client, the investment objectives of the client, the investment experience of the client, the time horizon, the liquidity needs, and the risk tolerance. Again, there's other information that the firm is going to have to get in order to ensure that the firm can perform its services and consistent with the client's best interest. These are the types of information that firms have to get today under the suitability standard, and are not too different. But again, I think the difference here is that they have to be obtained before a recommendation under regulation best interest, which includes a recommendation about the type of account. So for example, if a form is going to be used by the firm, which I think in many cases it typically would be because there needs to be record keeping about this information, the form should be neutral. It shouldn't be a form that is specific to an investment advisor account or specific to a broker-dealer account or any type of those accounts. It has to be a neutral enough form that it can help inform, the information on the form can help inform the decision about what type of recommendation should be made.
How much is enough in collecting this information?
Enough to be able to make a good decision consistent
the Goldilocks
with the rule.
approach. Not too much, not too little, just the right amount.
You know, I think it's, again, I don't think these are groundbreaking expectations at all. Even today, if under the FINRA rule, suitability rule, and under existing SEC requirements, if a broker-dealer rep wants to make a recommendation about a security to a customer, the broker-dealer rep is expected to understand that customer's position, investment position, and needs and objectives and situation and portfolio. That's the case under Reg BI. The difference is that we're also talking about services and account types. So for example, a rollover, an IRA rollover from a plan requires an understanding about the choices in the plan, the advantages of one being in the plan versus the IRA from the perspective of the client's needs and objectives, and what is in order to determine what's in the best interest of the client. So certainly the requirements have been augmented by focusing on account type and service, but the essential expectations are essentially the same.
Well, we're going to be jumping around a little bit here and make it a little bit interactive. And also, anybody has a question, feel free to stand up and shout it out. When we were outside just talking before, I was talking to James and I said, so what do you think your clients' compliance policies are going to be looking like here? And he said to me,
I said, I think for the most part, people are still writing policies and procedures. So back last summer with our clients, we sat down and really tried to put together a work plan and to order and triage how people were going to approach Reg BI compliance. And the things that really were essentially the long pole in the tent was what's required from a systems perspective. The systems in many of these firms are monolithic, takes a long time and is expensive to program. And so in terms of triaging the list, compliance policies and procedures are actually the easiest part because they come at the end when you've figured out everything that you're going to do to comply, and you essentially just have to memorialize that into a process. So I think firms started with what do we have to change from a systems perspective, and client intake is a good example. Do we need a new client intake form? What are the questions that we're going to ask on that form? And if you're lucky, a client will say, I want, discretionary management, or they'll say something else that clearly delineates account type and you can make easy decisions at that point in the process, but you need a system to record it. And you need to train your field force to sort of rethink their entire sales approach. If you've done something like me for 30 years the same way, you have a way in which you approach prospects. And now to turn that on its head and to say, now I've got to extract all kinds of information up front. And the truth is, clients may not want to give that. If it usually comes after they've made a decision and signed an agreement, they're much more likely to be forthcoming than to have a conversation at their first meeting with a financial professional where the financial professional says, tell me every place you've got money and what it's invested in. So the compliance policies and procedures, I think, are under development. We're helping to write those, but it seems like it's the last stage in the process.
If I could make 2 points about the developing compliance procedures, because I think James led into a couple of points I wanted to make, and my points are more directed, I think, towards mid-size firms. The large firms have dozens of people working on this issue, and qualified law firms like the ones represented on this panel, but the mid-sized firms are sometimes at a bit of they're not at a loss, but they're certainly under a time crunch. There's a lot of work to be done for them, and there's a short deadline. And I think 2 philosophical points that they should maybe consider. The first is that rather than worrying exclusively about what the SEC or FINRA might expect, they should really worry about what is best for investors. And I don't mean to say that tritely, but the most important issues are the ones that are going to be will most protect investors. And that leads to my second point, which is I would certainly prioritize those issues that are of greatest concern to investors. So to give a couple of mundane examples, it's far more important, in my view, to make sure that the conflicts are analyzed, particularly at the rep level, that they're properly mitigated and dealt with. And for example, to decide exactly what form you're going to deliver the relationship summary when it goes out with a quarterly package.
Yeah, we're going to come back to conflicts in a minute, David.
Right, yeah, but I guess I'm sorry, I'm making a general point, which is that I think for the procedures, it's very important to prioritize the procedures and to continue to keep in mind that the main point is to try to protect the customers.
And before I get started, I'll give the disclaimer that these are my opinions and do not necessarily reflect those of the SEC commissioners or the other staff. I mean, one of the points that I think you touched on that I think is going to be important is knowing your representatives and how they gather business, how do they collect business. I'm thinking of my own experience, the firm I was at, we had a number of representatives who they canvassed all of the factories and all of the businesses around to get those rollovers out of qualified plans. And with the account type recommendation now being part of the best interest, that really changes the timing of when you need to get disclosures, when you need to have information. Because in some ways, like when they walk in the door, they want to just say, you need a rollover, you need a rollover. And that's not necessarily going to be the case. It's not going to necessarily be the best interest of every person who walks in the door. And I think the systems, the procedures have to be built around those kind of unique circumstances. You got to know what your representatives are doing and how they're gathering their business.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying that now is the time to think again about renewing your efforts to take inventory?
Yeah. And not just inventory of products, which I think we'll talk about.
I'm talking about inventory of approaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think what we wanted to do here is spend some time delving in to challenges in training sales personnel, because we've been talking around that. This is where the rubber meets the road. And it's multidimensional, it's nuanced, and it touches on these topics that we've just been talking about. But to start off with, what are some of the issues that we're going to be dealing with? Product selection process, identifying and mitigating conflicts, special issues relating to dual registrants, sensitivity training for sales personnel, speaking to the point that David just made. These are up here. I think what we would like to do is just start peeling away the onion here, the layers of the onion, and dig a little deeper. David, I would start asking you about the product selection process.
Yeah, from my perspective, as I think about the task I would have had if I hadn't come back to the SEC, starting with a robust product selection process is critical, not only to deal with the conflicts, but to deal with the duty of care obligation. Because I think there's so many variations across your advisor base, your customer base, and you can control as a firm a lot more by inventorying that, taking a look at your product shelf, inventorying it, identifying, maybe segmenting it across types, segmenting it for the types of customers you offer it to, identifying within each product type the conflicts, whether it's compensation, whether it's cost, whether it's complexity, and then where there are differences. And I think particularly as I think of a usual retail-facing product shelf, the big fat middle is mutual funds and maybe variable annuities and individual securities. And then out of the fringes, you would have things that are more specific for particular kinds of needs that your customers may have. But within those, there are going to be distinctions, and the SEC doesn't say, we don't say, you've got to eliminate all of those distinctions. And you don't have to choose the cheapest one. But if there are going to be those distinctions, there needs to be a reason. There needs to be a reason, and that needs to be documented. It needs to be explained. It needs to be clear. And I think the firms can control that in a better way by starting with that, that process at the top, looking at what you have now and building a robust process around that. And then as you add things, having a documented process and procedure for identifying the conflicts, identifying the use case, identifying which customers, which representatives can use, sell, offer, present those products, I think is going to be critical, and it will help the firm reach or satisfy its obligations under at least the duty of care and the conflicts responsibility.
So how do you mitigate or eliminate conflicts of interest from a product perspective? For example, there are X dozen S&P 500 index funds that range in fees and expenses from 0.01 to many times that. I'm making these numbers up. But there are variations in expenses and services provided by the funds, reputational issues. You're a sales representative or you're a compliance officer supervising or a supervisor of that sales personnel. How do you approach distinguishing those products? With an S&P 500, why wouldn't you recommend the lowest cost one?
Which is probably an ETF and not a mutual fund at all.
Right, and I put that in there into the mix. It could be an ETF, but there are differences between mutual funds and ETFs that go beyond price. But from a product perspective, how do you identify what those conflicts are, but more importantly, how do you communicate them? Anybody, any takers on that one? Okay, well.
Well, I think mitigation of conflict is a big question, I think, for firms in adopting the procedures. That is one issue. When I was at FINRA, that was a question that we got quite often. What does it actually mean to mitigate, particularly in the infinite number of scenarios which you would meet? And I think, again, in referring to my remarks I just made, I think it's important to prioritize here with mitigation, just as with anything else. We can distinguish between index funds or mutual funds versus ETFs of an index quality, but the real question is, if you're offering, say, leverage or inverse ETFs, which pay a high commission, for example, just using that, they may not actually pay such high commissions, but assuming you have a complex product that pays a high commission versus another product that would provide an alternative investment opportunity with less cost and less risk, to me, it's easy then to decide how you're going to mitigate risk. There are a lot of situations, I think, that I would imagine the SEC and FINRA will focus on initially, where you have clearly difficult products and difficult choices where there's something simpler and less costly that could have been offered. And those are really where mitigation should be easiest, but also addressed first.
And I think the release is clear. If it's really an identical product, you've got to choose the cheapest one.
Yeah, I think that's what it'll have the pressure on the product suppliers, really, on the market, to drive down in that direction, which, of course, is part of the purpose. That's in the best interest of the customer. The retail customer is to have a lower cost product. So again, where there are those differences, you've got to be able to explain it. And you've got to be able to document it, why that is still in the retail customer's best interest. And I think the practical effect is it will push those kinds of things down.
Yeah, no, I'm aware of that. And my question is, it actually builds on that. Clearly, that would be an important factor, but sometimes there are other factors that you may not be able to, that may not be readily available. For example, if you're buying a fund in a mutual fund in a large family, there are features, for example, exchange features that might, or being part of a big fund family may be important to some people. I'm not suggesting in any way that it is or it isn't. And there are reasons to buy an ETF over a mutual fund and vice versa. And those go beyond cost. Are those factors that are going to be easily understood or communicated to clients?
I feel like I should have been on the panel 3 panels ago, because one of the things that the SEC needs to think about as part of this is the repeal of Rule 22D and the requirement that mutual funds sell at a price that's stated in the prospectus, and to allow people to actually charge commissions and to equalize the sales compensation for mutual funds if they want this to survive. And that's been on their regulatory agenda since at least 1992. But you have to be able to consider other factors besides cost. It's not the lowest cost alternative. And a good example is the comparison between, well, for a client who wants tax-free income, you could buy a tax-free muni bond fund or you could buy a laddered bond portfolio. And those will have different costs associated with them and much different investment experiences. If you're in a muni bond fund and interest rates rise and everybody else, sells out, you've bought yourself into the loss of principal associated with those redemptions. Whereas in a laddered bond portfolio, I can hold it until redemption or till maturity if it's my account and get all of my principal back. Those are different considerations in terms of what do I want? Do I want to be in a pooled product? Do I want to own the securities myself? With much different potential costs and investment outcomes. And the rule provides the flexibility to make those kinds of decisions. From a compliance perspective, the hard part is how do you document that decision and how do you supervise it as a firm? But it doesn't mean that in mitigating or eliminating conflicts, you've got to just, run to the lowest cost alternative every time. That would be the wrong outcome because the lowest cost alternative isn't always in the best interest of investors. And the hardest part about the rule is that there's no definition of best interest. The commission couldn't define it because it's not definable, because it changes based on the circumstances of an individual and it's an ad hoc determination.
We had a question in the back there. Could you just get a microphone there?
Exactly what you're saying of it's not always necessarily just fees that you have to take into account, but it's almost filtering per asset class. What do you want that asset class to look like, whether it's active management or passive management? And then in addition to that, what other parameters, whether it's track record or years in experience or whatever it might be, but defining those parameters for each asset class and then documenting that accordingly and having potentially ETFs and mutual funds to answer those solutions. So it's a cohesive approach, but it gives some advisors a little bit of flexibility that they may need per client.
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot of flexibility, but the release sort of reads, it reflects the recency bias, I believe, of the share class disclosure initiative, where they went out and found people who picked, different share classes that were otherwise identical, and you could have done a cost comparison and chosen the less expensive, and so they rounded up the usual suspects and had a big settlement on that issue. And that was probably appropriate, but then that sort of informs how the release reads in terms of this notion of cost and best interest. And that's a very narrow and simplified example of what's a very complex issue. And I say to my clients, and we talk about this all the time, the standard should be, what would you expect your financial professional to do? And you hope that they think hard about what the right solution is and they propose something that meets your needs. But writing that into policies and procedures and training people to meet that standard and to document it in a way that a regulator will respect is really the challenge that firms who are well-intentioned and want to achieve compliance continue to struggle with.
Let's just pick up on a point you just made there, James. In documenting this, as I'm thinking about this, there are some of these decisions or recommendations are based on many different factors, and they can be really nuanced, such as structural differences between mutual funds and ETFs. I don't think that your average investor necessarily understands how creation units are made and how there is an in-kind purchase and an in-kind redemption, which may be tax efficient. That doesn't come up on a golf course pitch. But they are, or they may be relevant in how you decide what an appropriate alternative would be. That feeds into the question, how do you document that? How much documentation is enough? I mean, we're now in the trenches here. You've got to advise your supervisors, your reps, your compliance personnel, how to keep track of all this to make it bulletproof. Any suggestions, David?
Well, I think that is going to be a challenge from my own experience. I mean, I think one of the challenges that we faced in my prior position under DOL rule was, for instance, with rollovers. How do you capture all the reasons why a rollover out of a qualified plan is better? And then how do you quantify that? And how do you do that in a way that can actually be supervised? A checklist, an electronic form, where it's standard responses. Is that going to capture all the answers? And I don't know that I can tell you that there is, that I know what the right answer is. I think where it comes down to, and then the other question is, can you expect your representatives to be drafting out lengthy narratives? I don't think that's realistic. It does kind of tie back to what I was saying before about your product shelf in terms of what you are making available and the reasons you're making available and the disclosures and information that and training you're providing to your representatives, because some of those things can be covered for the use case. But I think the documentation of those nuances and why this product, as compared to something that's similar, not exactly the same, is going to be, I think firms and the SEC, at least in my opinion, the SEC is going to be figuring that out as we go forward and we see the kinds of documentation that firms are using.
Yeah, to me, having procedures around a recommendation, the decision about a recommendation, for example, a recommended list that's acceptable for reps of securities and the circumstances in which those securities may be appropriate for a customer, it's still, to me, an easier issue than the question of literally mitigating conflicts. You've got a conflict, perhaps in the choice of two different products. How does a firm make sure that that conflict is mitigated in advance and that the rep does it? But some of the issues I feel that we're talking about, such as the decision about which securities are appropriate for a customer, what type of recommendation or account is appropriate for the customer, and how does a firm make sure that those are the ones that are recommended, I think are already the types of considerations that firms have to make.
And I would just say in the clients that we're working with, I think you're seeing all of the examples that David mentioned. So we have clients who are going to base their documentation of a recommendation based on their algorithmic tool and making sure that it's sufficiently robust to capture cost data so that when it generates a recommendation, implicit in that is the consideration of 10,000 Monte Carlo simulations that surely have to capture the universe of reasonably available alternatives, to pull down menus. I picked this security because, and pick off of the menu of 10 reasons, to more, customized documentation or structured products or things that are more complicated or risky, where you actually expect somebody to write a notation. The problem with that is that if you have 17,000 financial professionals, you have 17,000 ways of writing that note into your client notes. And so there's a sort of massive undertaking to try and train and standardize and get people to think about how they should document those things. But it's going to also require a massive supervisory effort. And I think you have to think about it from a compliance perspective a little bit strategically in terms of, where do we have to have more customized as opposed to perhaps none at all, or just standardized approaches to documenting the rationale for why a particular recommendation was made.
I want to look at this from the other side now. You're a salesperson in the field. And now you have to comply with whatever these processes are to document it, whether they, and this is putting aside the introduction of algorithms and artificial intelligence, which adds another enormous dimension of complexity to this whole discussion. And if they cancel the sessions tomorrow, we can get into it tonight. But anyway, how do you deal with pushback from the reps who look at you and say, I can't do this? How am I supposed to document everything? For every time I make a sales call, I have to write a 25-page summary of my recommendations and the basis for it. Of course, I'm overstating this, but how are firms going to deal with that kind of pushback?
We have a long philosophical discussion. I think it was touched on in part this morning. I think partly what it means is that accounts with lower assets are going to get effectively disintermediated. Go to our robo platform, because as a financial professional, I don't have time to spend writing notes for every conversation I have with a $40,000 account. And what you're going to see is, more attention directed at larger clients, and a segmentation, I think, in the service offering. And then FAs are going to sort of, I think, be convinced as part of that interaction with the firm that this is actually good for your practice, that we're going to help you develop ways to interact with your best customers on a more personalized basis and give them more customized recommendations, and that it's going to be, for many financial services firms, a way to sort of, talk to their financial professionals about how to improve the quality of their practice. And there will be the odd rep who pushes back, but that will happen. The other thing that will happen is that there will be a push as everybody's admitted into advisory accounts. And people are going to figure out, if I've got to take the time to do this, then I shouldn't be dependent on transaction-based compensation for the fees necessary to support this. And we're going to see a change in the way, in the mix of business, probably continued acceleration of the trends that people have talked about all day.
Yeah, that was one of the issues we were going to come to, but this was talked about a little bit earlier here. But looking at it from a compliance perspective, do you foresee seismic changes in the landscape of how businesses are structured? This has been a trend that's been ongoing for some time now. And I think the trend started in 1934 when the Exchange Act was enacted, maybe in 1940 when the Advisors Act was adopted. But that's a trend. Will it be accelerated? Will we see the end of sales representatives today as we know them?
No.
That's good to know.
I think, I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I really think that we shouldn't make an assumption that there's zero in terms of compliance requirements imposed on a registered rep until June 30th, when suddenly all these new requirements are going to spring upon them, and they're going to have to justify their recommendations and maintain records of the recommendations so that the supervisors can know what's going on. This already exists. Now, the issues are certainly augmented by Reg BI. They go into account questions. They go into reasonable alternative questions. We already imposed requirements concerning costs. So I think it's important to focus on the augmentation and the burdens that firms are going to undergo, but I don't think any of this should be foreign to compliant firms or their procedures. I do agree. I was trying not to be facetious in saying no, but I actually think there always will be a requirement for commission-based business for certain products. If you look at just illiquid products like variable annuities, which don't seem to be breaking into the IA side very much, or private placements, really commissions are the only appropriate way to sell those. So I think there's always going to be a need for that. And as I mentioned this morning, we haven't seen the end of the suppression of investment advisor fees on the other side, which might slow the migration a little bit. So I think there's always going to be a need for it, and I'm not denying that the burdens that are being imposed on the compliance platforms of firms that the Reg BI does impose, but I don't think we should assume that this is all foreign to firms and that they're not going to know how to handle this.
Okay, it's a very interesting issue, but we digress. Let's get back to the discussion of conflicts, disclosing conflicts. Some of this was touched upon earlier. I'd like to go a little bit deeper here. But the earlier panels, I got the sense that one of the most significant conflicts that we have to address is that from a compensation perspective. How is this going to translate into training sales personnel? What are they going to do in the field? For example, back in the old days, if you met a certain threshold, by November you got a free Thanksgiving turkey. if you met some sales goals here. Are we going to have to disclose the Thanksgiving turkey? And what happens if you have an incentive to make a sale because it will push you over a bonus threshold? Forgivable notes tied to production levels, that's another issue. That's not direct compensation, but indirect compensation. If you hit a sales target, a certain amount or a percentage of a note that was of money representing money loaned to you will be forgiven. How does that translate into supervision and compliance?
I think, I'm gathering you're looking my way for the answer on that. I think the answer is, in the guide, the rule, the adopting release talks about tiers of compensation, having big jumps at different levels, and so that suggests that at least in the example you were giving of, as you sell more, your compensation level, should be more gradual. I think is what we'll see. But for things like forgivable notes, I don't know if that's going to cause those to go away. I don't think so. At a minimum, they have to be disclosed. At a minimum, they're going to have to be disambiguated from any particular products or any particular types of accounts or anything that would encourage that representative to do something beyond asset gathering and the general thing that a professional does, which is to do business. But in terms of pulling those things out or making them go away, I don't see that as necessarily being being the intent of the rule to make them go away.
And I would say in my experience, firms are sort of far along in thinking about this process. So if you've lived through an investment advisor exam, the staff comes in and they look through your ledger to see every single source of cash flow to an investment advisor. And then that's the inventory by which they assess conflicts of interest at the advisor level. So starting with where are all the places where you get money and do those create conflicts of interest? What are the differences in the way that you get paid from products and other things as a second level of analysis about firm level conflicts of interest, looking at the menu of products and the ways and amounts that you get paid, and then driving down at the financial professional level to sort of make an assessment about what's in that compensation grid that has the potential to incent behaviors that wouldn't be customer friendly, and do we need to reevaluate or restructure that compensation? Firms are at various stages, I think, of thinking through that inventory of conflicts and how to mitigate or remove those, disclose them at a minimum if they can't be eliminated or mitigated. But there are ways to think about all of those issues in a way that will preserve, for example, financial incentives for financial professionals to actually do better and to earn more money based on their performance. I think there's a notion that sort of percolates that somehow, financial services firms shouldn't be allowed to make money. And of course, it would be in everybody's best interest to do everything for free. But that's not what the rule requires. And as long as you're thoughtful about the incentives and the behavior that they incent, I think there's still room for the Thanksgiving turkey if it's based on the total number of new assets that you bring in as opposed to the amount of American funds you sold last month.
Or net flows to advisory. I mean, you would see some of that, like DOL rule, I saw, some of that where firms were incenting the movement of assets or net flow into advisory accounts. And I think that now is going to be a more challenging to have that kind of compensation incentive.
See, if you have to act in the best interest of your customer, your retail customer. In other areas, we deal with some of this. Certainly, in practicing law, we deal with some of these areas. I can't tell you how many times somebody has come to me and said, "I want to start a mutual fund. What do I have to do? Get me started." And against my self-interest, the first thing I do is, after I understand what their business is, I try and talk them out of it. Because, as you know, you need a lot of infrastructure, and most people who are operating an investment management company out of, with two guys and a dog over a garage, are not going to have that infrastructure to do that. We try and talk them out of it. I talk myself out of earning legal fees. Are we going to see that? Are people will it change the way salespeople approach talking you out of particular investments, talking you out of an advisory account? I guess I'm looking at it from the other way around. Will the sales process change in the way salespeople approach this?
Well, so I think one of the hard questions is the whole discussion about implicit hold and monitoring. So you come in and you say, I want a brokerage account instead of an advisory account because all I want to put into it is the stock I inherited from my grandmother. And so you've got a concentrated stock, single position. How often do you have to say to somebody, you really should sell some of that and diversify? And is there an implicit hold? I think in that respect, it will, potentially change customer interactions, and firms will have to think about how they deal with circumstances where they really want to make sure they're not on the hook for those kinds of unique account relationships that are really customer driven. I mean, how many times do you have to tell somebody, if you're a non-discretionary investment advisor, that they should diversify their account while the client continues to ignore you? And maybe at that point, you should say, I don't want to keep charging you an advisory fee. You should move over to a brokerage account, and I'm not going to continue to collect a fee to give you advice you ignore. So I think that will happen.
Okay,
but it should be happening now. That's not a new requirement.
Right, that's not a new requirement, but the issue is, or what I'm interested in is, how will this regulation change that? Will it accelerate it, slow it down, or have no effect? But I think that's a good way to pivot into a related issue, which I'm going to defer to Tom and David to kick off, which is, how are the regulators going to approach supervision or examination of these new rules and how they're being implemented? They're all new, and nobody quite knows how the regulators are going to approach it, or exactly how all of the policies and procedures and systems that they're developing are going to play out. Come the effective date, the SEC or FINRA knocks on your door, says, we're here. What happens next?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think the answer, and I think it was discussed some this morning, or at least referenced some this morning, is, this is not an intent to, okay, on July 1st, you better be in full compliance, or we're going to get you. I mean, this is really, I think the initial focus has to be on, our firms getting towards compliance? Have they made good faith efforts to get in compliance? Do we understand where some of the pain points are? Do we understand where some of the weak points are? And how can we help firms overcome those? That's got to be the starting place. And I think, and I'm really thinking there of an examination standpoint. From an enforcement standpoint, other than in a couple of examples, I can't imagine an enforcement action or enforcement interest for quite some time. The two places where I see an exception is if you're still running sales contests, tied to specific products. Yes, we're probably going to pay attention to that. And if you haven't done anything, and if you've stood back and just said, I'm not really that interested in getting compliant, then we might take an interest in that from an enforcement standpoint. But I think it's got to start with helping the firms get more compliant.
Yeah, I agree with David. I think initially, certainly FINRA is interested in the extent to which firms are preparing now for it. And once it goes into effect, there's going to be an interest just in how they've implemented it. But I think it's not going to be till later, as FINRA and the SEC sees specific problems arising, that they will be, I think, focusing on those problems. And hopefully will be issue guidance first, either in the form of notices or enforcement actions when it's an extreme problem. But initially, I think there's just an interest by both FINRA and I would imagine the SEC as well in understanding what firms are doing to implement, and then initially how they've implemented it.
Yeah, and I would just make my own observation that the regulators, from my perspective, representing the companies who do this, have been taking a more reasonable approach in terms of going out, understanding how the markets work, what people are doing, coming out with the compliance observations, OCs, alerts. And then when you see the types of enforcement actions, usually they're, and again, speaking for myself, usually they involve some sort of egregious act or failure to act. And it's very hard to explain. You want your clients to be aware that they have to comply with the law or risk an enforcement proceeding. But we are always quick to point out that these types of actions are designed to go after people who are not doing anything or doing something that's so ridiculous, and our clients and your clients are not in that category.
If I could just, raise one issue that I think is worth reiterating over and over again, and that is this desire to come back as a regulator and 3 years from now sit on a panel and talk about best practices. And the reality is that the complexity of this regulation and the fact that it's being built off of firms' existing systems, procedures, reports, surveillance tools, leads to a variety of practices which I believe are all effective, but are not all the same. And it would be an unfair result of the OC examination process if they drove towards standardization of disclosure or policies or procedures when those don't really reflect the unique circumstances or supervisory practices or tools of individual firms. And there's a hazard to want to try and articulate a single standard of compliance. And I would hope that we're not here 3 years from now talking about the best practices that ignore the fact that, mid-sized firms, for example, may have a completely different system because they don't have 17,000 registered representatives, and they know the 400 people who sell for them, and they interact with them in a different way. And that the expectation about automation or other kinds of surveillance that are the best practices in a firm with tens of thousands of financial professionals doesn't bleed over into the rest of the industry in a way that's not a fair expectation.
Building on that, now that the rule is going to become effective, what difference is this going to make, the new rule, when it's fully implemented? What difference will it make from a compliance perspective? How will the lives of compliance officers change? And the second part I'd like to just explore here is how is implementation of this rule going to affect potential liability of registered representatives, of advisors, of broker-dealers, of compliance officers, and of firms in general? Will it change the landscape of potential liability, or is it just a continuum? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'll start at least from the standpoint of when I think of SEC liability, for instance, for compliance officers. I mean, if you look at the cases that have ever been brought against chief compliance officers or their staff, they're relatively few and far between, and they typically involve fairly significant failures. I don't see that changing here. I do agree with the concept that there are going to be a number of additional items or additional considerations that chief compliance officers are going to have to be aware of in doing their jobs. But it's not going to change, I don't think, the SEC's view that CCOs who are doing their best, who are giving it the good faith effort, are not going to run afoul simply because their firms have had some error or some mistake or had a failure.
Right, and one of the things we were talking about in preparing today is the standards of care or the standards of liability. And this has always been the case. This shouldn't change, but there is no private right of action under the Investment Advisors Act. If a disgruntled advisory client is unhappy, the SEC, not the client, can sue for a violation of the anti-fraud rules, but there are state contractual liabilities, potential liability. And the same thing under regulation best interest. If I get this correctly, there is no private right of action under regulation best interest, but you have a different means of resolving the individual disputes through arbitration and so forth. And there's all the state contractual potential for liability. So I'm going to suggest that possibly this really will not change the overall landscape of potential liability. Anybody have a thought?
So Jay shouldn't invite people to comment when they have thoughts, because I have thoughts about everything, so I apologize. I would say a couple of things. One, when you think about the scope of potential liability and what's new here, as Tom mentioned, it's incremental. It's not like firms don't have compliance policies and procedures. I don't think there's a sea change here in terms of the day-to-day responsibility of compliance officers. The one place where I see potential risk from an arbitration perspective is under the duty of care and the consideration of reasonably available alternatives, and getting in front of an arbitrator and having to answer, well, what did you think about in terms of the comparison of reasonably available alternatives, and how did cost factor into that, and where's the documentation to support that determination? And the fact that they've sort of now specified exact steps that you have to follow sort of lead to the potential for arbitration awards, I think, if you can demonstrate that somebody didn't follow those steps exactly. And to me, that's a place where there's a potential for what I will call more procedural kinds of liability than maybe there were in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Just following up on that, the role of the CCO, when I read these regulations, I always like to look at the back part of the release to look at the economic considerations and the economic impact. It is also very revealing, but how do we think the role of the CCO will change, and the role of the CCO department? Will we need additional compliance? Will there be additional, in reality, will there be additional compliance costs? Will there be additional in-house legal costs? Again, I'm talking now about the larger firms. And what about outside counsel? We certainly are seeing clients engaging us to provide advice on this, which it's noticeable because we've noticed an uptick in the types of questions we're getting. But how long will this continue? And just overall operations, do we see overall costs increasing to broker-dealers and advisors? I'll say maybe.
I would say that there are some things that are going to require some additional bodies, and somebody's going to have to look at the documentation around recommendations, at least at some level. There are places where there are going to be additional documentation requirements. For example, if you supplement written disclosure with oral disclosure, you're supposed to record that every time you do it. So if my disclosure says, I might act as an investment advisor or broker-dealer, and I'll tell you, when I make a recommendation for your account, which capacity I'm acting in. Then when you provide that oral disclosure, you're supposed to make a note of it. Somebody's going to have to come along and supervise the box ticking on a lot of additional stuff. I don't know that that's, super expensive in terms of compliance personnel, but it is an additional process, and there are going to be incremental costs associated with compliance that will vary by firm in terms of how manual your processes are. If somebody's doing a pull-down menu to justify something with a higher cost, that's probably easier to surveil for systematically than if you've got to go in and read 17,000 notes. So I think, it's hard to know exactly what the cost will be. Maybe is probably the right answer, but definitely more.
I do think, certainly at the outset, the implementation, it makes sense. I mean, in addition to building the systems, setting up committees, setting up the infrastructure for the different kinds of analyses and that firms need to do, is it going to be a cost? I do think, as a practical matter, in the adopting release, does kind of push in this direction, which is identifying those pain points, identifying those points of risk. Where are you most likely to have the conflicts? Where are you most likely to have issues with a particular product or customer type? That is going, because compliance groups, they're not infinite. The compliance dollars are not infinite. And, and they are a limited resource in every firm that I know of. And so you have to over time, identify what those are. And I think the adopting release does identify some of those. And I think firms will, once they've gotten the infrastructure in place, will naturally, push those limited resources to focus on those pain points or those risk points.
Yeah, if this works the way it's supposed to, right? Profits will come down and costs will go up and everything will be compressed. That's just the reality of it.
I wanted to raise one issue just to pivot. At the last panel, there was a very interesting discussion about the disclosure documents and giving them to a potential customer or client. And does the client actually read it and understand it? Does it achieve the intended result? Jason made asked a great question about those agreements that you check on when you download an app. And yeah, I'm one of the nerds that actually reads this. I had a client that had I digress, I had a client that was notorious for his dictated texts that were rife with hilarious typos. So he finally gets this program that corrects it for him, and he tells me about it. And he said, you should sign up for this. And I looked at it, and I clicked on the contract, and I couldn't believe what I was reading, that this company downloads all your texts, reads them, has access to all of your contacts, and tens of thousands of people are buying this. Now, if people start reading the disclosures on conflicts, will customers be alarmed? And do you have an obligation to ensure that when you're handing this document on the golf course, making a recommendation, are people going to read it? And that's a question that can't be answered, but I was intrigued by that discussion.
Nobody's going to read it on the golf course. I find that whole discussion silly, and context matters, and nobody should have asked the SEC that question, and the SEC shouldn't have answered it, because if it's a recommendation, Reg BI applies, but nobody's going to read their CRS while the foursome behind them plays through. So I do think...
the way I play golf, I probably will.
They might just play through anyway. Yeah. But we've written a number of Reg BI disclosures already. They tend to read sort of like Form ADV brochures. They're somewhere between 10 and 15 pages. We think we've written them in a way that's relatively investor-friendly. Do I actually believe anybody's going to read it? No. I wouldn't read it if I got it, and that's sort of a threshold, sort of standard that I apply. Would I read this if it came in the mail to me? And I already know what happens. I don't even, take those envelopes in the house most of the time. So, we've spent a lot of time and been very thoughtful, and the people who read it will get good, clear, informative disclosure, but I don't think it's going to have a major impact.
Well, I think people will read them, and it's there for the record for people to look at. That's a different issue. We're just about out of time. We really wanted to take a look at some of the issues involving dual registrants. Some of these issues were discussed earlier, but I would just take this opportunity to throw it out to the floor to see if there are any questions. You in the back, raise your hand. Or are you just stretching? Oh, okay, got it.
I thought you were just voting in favor of my assessment that nobody will actually read it because they don't read anything.
Question in the back.
No, she's second.
Oh, okay.
I'm getting a support for my perspective.
Okay. Scott, should we go on or Okay, just one more topic we wanted to touch on. It was touched on a little bit earlier, special considerations for dual registrants. The adopting release contains a whole discussion about some of the challenges that dual registrants are going to face. And my question, and that, in case you're wondering, it begins on page 124 of the non-federal register release. But the issue here is, will reps who are employees of duly registered companies, are they up for the challenge of wearing two hats and complying with these enhanced requirements? Specifically, you now have, if you're acting in both capacities, you have to be conversant in best interest standard and a fiduciary standard. And you have to be able to communicate it, and it gets complicated, especially if you are a representative with a Series 7 or only a Series 6, and you can only make recommendations as to mutual funds. We discussed some of that today. Any kinds of challenges that we can point to?
I get 1 minute to answer according to my number. You've got to be old to remember the American General Capital Planning letters from the 1970s that talked about how it was really hard, maybe impossible for reps to put on and take off hats because you couldn't separate what you learned on the advisory side from what you would implement on the brokerage side and vice versa. The release actually seems to recognize that concept in a way that is unexpected for me, because it suggests that if you are acting as an investment advisor, even if you execute transactions and receive commission-based compensation for that, you can still treat that as acting as an investment advisor for Reg BI. So the release clearly contemplates that you can take off that hat and put it back on. It's a challenge for the legal and compliance professionals to try and figure out how to draft the documents and the policies and procedures to make that effective.
But it's good for hat makers and haberdashers. On that note, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience, and I want to thank the people on this panel for the time they took to prepare for this and lending their knowledge.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.